All right, so we talked a bit about ubiquitous language, and it's definitely one of the key elements, I think, of domain-driven design. So,
Yeah.
just briefly, how do you go around identifying and managing this ubiquitous language? Because you also learn more as you move along, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you need to change your modeling, your
Yeah.
existing code, your based on the new understanding. So how does this happen in
Yeah.
practice?
Well, many ways, of course. Well, as you suggest, right? A change in the domain is a change in the language, is a change in the model. Um, so, in any case, that sort of we call it refactoring towards deeper insight. It's not just code refactoring; it's model refactoring, right? If we learn something new, if we get new insight, actually put in the work to make the model, the code, the documentation, etc., back, in sync with that new understanding. That's very much the first thing, right? If you allow this to sort of diverge, you will end up back where we started, right? With a system that doesn't look like how we understand it anymore. Um, so that's key, right? It's this desire to keep these things in sync. And then an important part, I think, that is maybe under discussed is this sort of observing. You need to be in a mindset where you're always observing and listening for this language. If people are describing something and they mention some word, instead of just sort of letting that pass by, you should think, wait a minute, is that word, is that important? Is that relevant? Should we use that? Are they using this word for something else that I haven't heard yet, right? And you talk about it and say, well, what do you mean by that specifically? Or you can ask the question like, yeah, we talked about this, and then we had this edge case, and now you said, oh, we have a process of, I don't know, let's say, giving the money back when it turns out that they overpaid us, or if there's a change in the delivery. And what do you call that process? Oh, we call it refunds, or we call it reimbursements, or something like that. And then you start digging for that, like how would you use that in a sentence, right? Because the language is not just words, right? It's not just things. It's sentences, it's grammar, it's idioms, right? It's perfectly possible to use words from that language in a completely grammatically correct English sentence and still end up saying something that no domain expert would ever say. So you dig for that and you look for that nuance and you observe when people use words. I think that's sort of a skill that you need to develop that will give you a lot of insight in the domain, and that will sort of let things emerge that you can then use to make better models that are more explicit, right? Instead of just having some function that pays back money, you can say, oh, this is the refund thing, right? Or the reimbursing process, or whatever you call it. Even the business rules, right? That people say, oh, but if customers buy five of these, they get some discount for something else. What do you call this? Oh, this is the loyalty discount, right? Instead of just saying it's an if clause somewhere, can we name that rule? Can we say, oh, this is the loyalty discount for high spenders or something? Give that a name. Name your object that way. Put an object in between. Delegate the decision that is in that if statement. Delegate it to that object or to that function or whatever. Give it that name, and now your code, instead of an if and some numbers, it says apply this business rule with this name, right? So the business rules become first class. So you're constantly looking for that language, embedding it in your model, in your code, in your other artifacts. And then, of course, when something changes, when somebody says, "Yeah, remember how we had that rule about discounts? Um, we're giving too many discounts. We want to have this other limitation." Now you can look at the code, you see exactly where that rule sits, and you can say, "Oh, let's combine this with this other rule, right? Or let's make, I don't know, maybe you need to change the code, or add something or remove something, or And when you keep doing that, embedding that language and model into the code and make it more explicit and a richer language. Um, Simple example, right? You don't delete an employee, you don't create a new customer, right? You hire an employee and you fire them, or you promote them, or they quit. Well, if you could create new customer, you'd be rich fast, right? You just keep creating new customers. No, you're onboarding, or they signed up, or they bought something. Bring that language in there, and your code starts telling the story of what it's doing and why it's doing that. And then when something changes, when you get to this point where your code is very mature, right? Your domain model, your code reflects the model that people have in their head and even influences it as well, right? Your code and your artifacts, because we think about it that way now. We think of it as different rules instead of nested if blocks. We think of it as a composition of rules, right? That's a much higher level abstraction. That's much more practical. You can start thinking of it as building blocks that you can combine. When you get to that point with your system, when a new change comes, you're not really changing code anymore. Of course, it's still code. You're still changing it, but you're not going into a deeply nested if clause. You're thinking of it as adding new elements of the same type, or removing things of that type, or reordering the way they are applied. Maybe it's rules that I can reorder, or maybe I can reconfigure the individual rules, right? I say, oh, we have this rule that says, 5% discount in this specific situation, but now we decided we want to make that configurable. So you change that object, that thing, to have a parameter, and now you have a configurable rule that you can recompose, etc. Right? So you get to a point where your code is so expressive that you don't think about it as typing individual statements anymore, but you think of it as recombining these building blocks. That's a very powerful thing. It's somewhat like a domain-specific language, maybe, or whatever, but the point is that you get this benefit. And then when something changes, right, it's just a trivial thing. So I think that's the chief mechanism you should sort of pursue for dealing with ubiquitous language. And then depending on your context, you might need RFCs and be super formal about it, or you could just have like a glossary in a README file, or anything in between, right? I very much like the idea of living documentation, which is where you, as much as possible, you use annotations in your code to document the language. So you have maybe a definition, a definition annotation. You put some explanation there, and then you have something that renders this documentation in readable form for non-programmers. And then you can. There's a great book about it called Living Documentation by Cyril Martrer that sort of expresses these ideas in a domain-driven design mindset as well. But of course, it doesn't apply to all situations. Sometimes you actually really need that that long RFC process with different committees looking at it and whatever. But that's the extreme case.
One thing that I'm thinking now when you talk about the domain language is that I've seen another area of design that does a bit of it, which is UX. One thing in UX is you do information architecture and you figure out what are the concepts that you see, let's say, on a page, particularly in more complex screens. And then the relations between those, the actions that you can apply on each of those and so on. And that's how they figure out how the UX can be improved or can be designed properly. And I was thinking whether you have seen relationships between what is in the interface with what is in the domain that you model.
I'm sort of aware that they have a lot of concepts that are very similar to what we're doing in domain design. I haven't really dug into UX, so it's not really my area. But a lot of it seems to make sense to me that they're also thinking in models and the mental model of the user and how you communicate that and how they go through processes. I think there's a lot of similarity there indeed. There is a risk that if you look too much only at UX, well, the way I would describe it actually is that what is a user interface? It is a bounded context. It is another model. So even if I have, I don't know, let's say you have Twitter, right, the social media app. There is a rich model underlying Twitter, right, with how everything works. But the user sees a different model, right? Even though it's talking about the same things, right? The tweet exists in that underlying backend system, and it exists as a user concept in the user interface. But it means something different, right? It's very much related. It's talking about that same fundamental concept of a tweet, but it's dealing with different properties of that and different. So if you think of a user interface now, a user interface is a model that provides like a facade to the model that is underpinning it, and that difference can be small or great, right? In a simple application, it would be equal almost, or in an application that is aiming at a very a small group of experts, right? So if you build an application for, let's say, day traders, your underlying model and the model they interact with will be identical, right? They are actually more expert in day trading than you ever will be. And all you can do is give them enough tools and enough freedom to do whatever they want. When you're building Twitter, your users are totally not domain experts in this massive complex thing that is Twitter now under the hood, right? So that's a typical sort of you need more UX for dealing with a larger audience that is more distant from you than when you're dealing with experts who know the domain better than you do. But it's a risk that if we focus too much on the user, I think it's great that our industry has sort of figured out, oh, we need to focus on the user and the user journey and all of that. That's absolutely fantastic, but it's not all there is, right? We tend to we say in DDD, we say the user interface is not the model. It's not the model of the whole thing, right? There's going to be things that are simply under the hood that are not visible, that deliberately should not be visible, but it's usually a richer model in many situations.
Yeah, because I think it has this extra capacity for change, which is very
That too, yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Okay, so